Hello and welcome to the Small Business Briefing, coming to you from SBAM headquarters downtown Lansing. As you can see behind me, it is a beautiful day, Sarah. I think that we have had more sunlight in February than any other February than I can remember over my entire life. So even though the legislature put me in a bit of a bad mood last week, sun has got me back in a good mood today.
I know, I agree. It was so wonderful to be outside this weekend. I kept saying it's 50 degrees in February. So the sun is a gift right now for sure. Thank you all for joining us today. I'm Sarah Miller, SBAM's Vice President of Marketing and Strategic Communications. And I'd like to welcome one of our new members, Razorback Metals. They're located in Chelsea. So thank you to the owner, Aaron Dower, and the team for joining. And we're welcoming our new member on behalf of our sponsor, Consumers Credit Union. Consumers offers terms up to 20 years with no balloon payments on real estate business loans. So check them out at consumerscu.org. So Brian, you mentioned your bad mood last week with the legislature. While we were on the briefing last Thursday and discussing the tax plan, it actually narrowly passed while we were on the air. So talk a little bit more about what transpired.
Well, it was in the House of Representatives to start with. And while we were literally in the middle of the briefing, there was this thing called a call of the House. And when you would ask, well, what do you think? How long will it be? And I said, well, I don't think it'll be that long. Once they do a call of the House, it'll, one way or another, it's going to either pass or not. And if it's not, then they'll have to go back to the drawing board. There is a razor thin margin in the House of Representatives between the two political parties. And basically what had happened was the majority party, so the Democrats have the majority in the House of Representatives. There was one member who was opposed to the large corporate subsidies, and he was holding out. And so the Democrats really needed to find one Republican to flip, and they did end up finding that. I thought it was worth mentioning and sharing Dylan Wegela, who is a state representative, Democrat from Southeast Michigan. And he says in a tweet 3 days ago, I was the lone Democrat to vote no. When I was a teacher in my classroom, I hung a poster that read, "Stand up for what you believe in, even if you're standing alone." I live that today. And I said that this thread is the speech I wasn't allowed to give on the House floor. And then there's a link to it. But there's a when Representative Wegela had decided not to support the overall tax package, and keep in mind, for different reasons than what SBAM opposed it for, but sometimes you find yourselves on the same side as people for different reasons, but nevertheless, this when that passed, it passed in a kind of a really quick way. So they did a call of the House, which means that everybody has to be there, and they send the sergeants out to get you if you're not. And then they issued what's called Rule 32, and Rule 32 says that you must be in your seat. So not only do you have to be in the House of Representatives, but also have to be in your seat when they call the House to order there. And then they called the vote straight away, and they seemed to know that they had the one representative that they kind of flipped from opposition to support, and that puts us in a position where it passed, and it passed really quick. They did not allow any debate or any speeches. So the use of the call of the House, the use of Rule 32 were kind of unusual. They called the previous question as well. And by using that procedural maneuver, what that did was eliminate any chance of debate or discussion. So the one representative that I just referred to wanted to explain his vote, was not given an opportunity to do so in the debate. Neither were any of the other 54 members, actually 53. I think somebody was absent, members that voted no. So it passed, and it was disappointing. Just as a reminder, they put a whole bunch of things together. They did the retiree exemptions, ended up equalizing those more. So working seniors got left out, but at least those with 401ks and IRAs get treated the same as those with pensions, save for police and fire that have unlimited exemptions. And then, so that part they made a little more even between public and private sector. So that was a good change, but still there was that, the earned income tax credit for lower income workers, an earmark, a $500 million a year earmark just for specific big business incentives. And then also elimination of the small business tax cut. In other words, the rate, reducing the rate that small businesses pay that was already in law, that was canceled through kind of an accounting trick that they put in the law, that will result in rebate checks, $180 rebate checks, but at the cost of a permanent rollback in the rate. So it passed the House. It was pretty disappointing, especially the method in which it was used. And usually, if you're proud of a proposal, you don't stop debate on that proposal. In this case, though, through the committee process and in the House floor, they seem to not want to let any opposition speak at all, from top to bottom. So that's where we stand.
All right. And then following that vote, there was a little bit of maneuvering going on in the Senate, and any Senate action was actually subsequently delayed as well. So tell everybody what happened and, how long we might have to wait for that decision.
Well, we won't have to wait too long. It'll pass in the Senate tomorrow when they're back in session. There was a kind of a procedural maneuver that was used to slow it down, to just basically postpone it for one day. The Republicans in the Senate have the minority, but there is one person and that has a position that can act as chair of the Senate. It's fourth in line of succession, but when he was the only one in the room, he took the opportunity to adjourn the Senate. So before they got a chance to vote on it. So that happens from time to time. The last year when the Republicans had the majority and the Democrats had the minority, they did a quick motion to adjourn, and the lieutenant governor adjourned the Senate. And they call that a kind of the quick gavel, before anybody realized what happened, adjourn it. Once it's adjourned, you're done. You can't just go back into session unless you've posted for a new session. Well, if you accidentally adjourned or didn't intend to adjourn that early, you can't do it. So all it did was delay the action for one session day. So tomorrow, I expect tomorrow they'll go into session at 10 o'clock, and probably by 10:15 or so, they'll have this conference report on the tax plan passed and onto the governor for signature. The big question, though, is whether or not it is granted what's called immediate effect. Our Constitution says that bills passed do not take effect for 90 days after the final session of the year. Call it when you adjourn, sine die, or adjourn without date of return. And so in order to have a bill be given immediate effect, so not have to wait until 90 days after the final adjournment of the year, it needs a 2/3 vote. And it's not clear that this would get 2/3 vote for immediate effect. As a practical matter, what that would mean is that the rebate checks would not happen. And if the rebate checks didn't happen, I think what that would mean was that the accounting maneuver would also not happen in time to stop the rollback of the rate. So it's actually possible that the rate rollback could still happen. Although I do think that the governor has sent some pretty clear signals that she will attempt to declare the rollback unconstitutional if the legislature doesn't effectively eliminate the rollback, which means that it'll be fought out in court and will take months or sometimes in this case maybe up to a year to get resolved. The frustrating part about all this is that the state has a $9.2 billion surplus, and the lengths at which they seem determined to go to prevent a small business tax cut are puzzling, to say the least.
All right, well, let's move on to a couple of other topics. First up, a big Ford deal was announced today to build a new battery factory.
Yeah, and this one is going to be in Marshall, so the middle part of the state, south of Lansing, right around where I-94 and I-69 come together. And this is a big site and a big development. It was in the news a little while ago when Governor Youngkin from Virginia had said, we're not going to go after this deal because it's a joint venture with a Chinese company that is owned and controlled by the Chinese government. And so it kind of made political waves at that point, but it became clear at that point also that Michigan was in the running and going after this deal. They've won the deal, but at a pretty high cost. So it's a $3.5 billion plant. They will make the electric, they'll make batteries there for vehicles in a joint venture with a Chinese firm. And that joint venture will supply like kind of the next generation of what we'd consider drivetrains. So this is like the car is going to be built around this feature, and that's the reason why the state's going after so many of these battery plants, is because there's a new center of gravity going to be created somewhere around like the new way cars will be propelled, and so they're really making a hard play at getting as much of that here in Michigan as they can. The theory being that all the other stuff that touches transportation, automotive, mobility, autonomous vehicles, and so forth will kind of locate around it, around this most important central piece. So the package itself is $1 billion. And it's another one of those things, Sarah, where I get why the state's going after these deals so hard. It's just very difficult to swallow that the state is saying it cannot afford a $650 million tax cut already in law due to small businesses and individuals. And then last week, and then this week, $1 billion incentive for a single company building a new factory here. The incentive comes in a bunch of ways. Some of it's like cash through the SOAR fund. And then they're doing PA 198 agreements on real and personal property taxes, and then a Renaissance zone as well that lasts for 15 years. So you add all that up, it's more than $1 billion in incentives that they're providing to Ford, and they have indicated that it's not done yet. They're going to come back for site preparation support as well. So just yet another thing. I get why they're going after the deal. SBAM has never opposed this type of economic development, but it shouldn't come at the expense of small business relief. Because really, as big as Ford is tiny compared to the economic impact of small businesses. When you look collectively across our state, small businesses are about half of all of the jobs. And it's in a lot of communities, it's all or most of the jobs. So it's pretty big, and I just hope that the state does not continue to take for granted what it means for so many of our local communities to have small businesses that are thriving and doing well, and the state needs to continuously continuously create a better environment for their success in the future. And it's not really clear. This is the first, in the last couple of years anyway, this is the first time that we saw like a very explicit trade to say we must take away from small business, take a tax relief, tax cut that is already in law and due to small business. We're going to cancel that and give to a handful of large corporations. And it's just, the state can afford to do both if it really feels it needs to do both, but that's not a good trade.
Well put, well said. And I know our members must be thankful to have your insight and leadership on this particular issue. Let's talk a little bit about the adopt and amend issue that we've covered in detail here. Probably not a huge surprise that that's now headed to the Supreme Court. What do we know so far?
This is on that minimum wage and mandatory paid sick leave. The sick leave part only affects small businesses. And then the minimum wage, of course, affects everybody. This was something that the question is not whether or not minimum wage is good or bad. That's not what the court is looking at. That just happens to be the subject of the law that's being challenged. The question is, can the legislature amend statute that went into place through citizens initiative? And as you might recall from previous broadcasts, was not at all surprised that the Court of Appeals overturned the Court of Claims and found that status quo in minimum wage and paid sick leave law is legal and was properly passed. That has been challenged. It was challenged on Friday. There was so much happening last week. I did feel like this was kind of missed by many people, but again, not a surprise. The proponents of throwing out current law on minimum wage and reinstituting citizens initiative language from 2018, which is much more costly for small business, that has been formally appealed to the Michigan Supreme Court. It's too early to determine whether or not, number one, will they accept the appeal? If they reject the appeal, then it means current law stands. If they accept the appeal and take arguments, which I expect they will accept the appeal and take arguments, at the time when arguments are given, it wouldn't be until then that we would get a better sense for what the timing could be on when they would make a decision. But one thing I know is that this process, challenging something to the Supreme Court, is not particularly fast. So I feel pretty confident to our members that might be impacted by this, and many industries will be directly impacted, but everybody's indirectly impacted by this type of change. That it's not right around the corner. Not like in a couple of weeks, or probably not even in a couple months. This is the sort of thing where I could see dragging out well into this year. But as soon as we hear when they've got things scheduled, arguments scheduled, you can count on two things. We will let you know, but number two, SBM will lead with other business organizations in speaking into the system, actually filing an amicus brief, laying out the small business position and our desire to maintain the status quo.
All right. And another topic we've been covering more and more lately is education, and just how it's, going to impact our future workforce. But there's some new numbers out, and K-12 enrollment has dropped. Any big surprises?
It has dropped again, although the drop was a lot less pronounced than it was in some recent years. So a few years ago, when a lot of public schools were closed, other parents found alternatives, went to private schools and charter schools to find places where there was in-person schooling. Enrollment in traditional public schools, or overall in public schools, dropped 62,000 back a couple of years ago. This year's drop was about 6,200, so about 10%. So a drop, but not as pronounced as before. But it answers a question that I think had been on people's minds generally, was those who exited public schools and went to private schools and through the pandemic to find in-person education, would they come back? The answer is no. On balance, they're not coming back. So we're back to what we'd call the normal decline in enrollment that you would expect based on population. So there's a big chunk that got lost in public schools to private schools a few years ago. Now the decline that you see in terms of the overall population in the public schools looks really like the decline in the population of the kids that are entering the school in the first place. So unfortunately, we do expect this to continue generally, this kind of smaller decline. That decline of 6,200, that brings the overall enrollment in public schools to 1.44 million. So you would call that nearly even, slightly declining. But looking at the overall size of the population, the people that were born 5 years ago we would just, that's how you predict what's this year's kindergarten going to be. And we know how many are going to graduate or exit. That this type of decline of 5 to 10,000 students, probably what for the foreseeable future we should expect to see. One of the reasons why workforce development and labor force participation is such a high priority for SBAM, because we do see that that continued erosion in the overall size of the pie, the population itself.
All right. Political parties are having their conventions. So talk about the process a little bit and what small business owners might need to know about things that are decided at these conventions. Michigan's
Constitution actually leaves a bunch of decisions up to political party conventions, and it's somewhat unusual how many positions, like there are these delegates that go to party conventions and they select who the candidates are for things like attorney general, lieutenant governor, secretary of state, state board of education. All of those positions are decided by these conventions. So there was a new crop of delegates for the Republican Party and the Democratic Party that were elected last year. They now take office. It is technically an elected office. They organize locally. They send delegations to a state convention. Those state conventions conduct business, including picking the candidates that the general public gets to vote on later on in the process. But the first thing that they do is pick leadership for their own political parties. Over this last weekend, the Democrats had their convention, and no surprise, they picked the same chair. They've been winning a lot lately, so they're not making any changes, which you wouldn't have expected them to do with the type of electoral success they've had in, especially in this last year. So they kept their leadership at the top of the party intact. The Republican Party has their convention next weekend. Have no idea how that is going to turn out. The chair of that party is retiring from the position. It's wide open. There are a lot of people running, like 10 or 11 or 12, like a bunch of people running, and not exactly clear. I've heard that that there are some that believe that Matt DePerno, who ran for Attorney General unsuccessfully against Dana Nessel in the last election, might be the favored one to be the chair of the party, but but it's hard to tell in these conventions and how things are going to go. So the parties are picking their leadership, and then from there, they get involved in the politics all the way through to the process. But the part that our members are going to be more interested in are who are the candidates that these parties put up for the positions that they get to pick. I'd mentioned several of them. Get this, they actually get to pick who runs for Supreme Court as well. So these party conventions have a lot of authority in Michigan's political system, and so we'll get a sense. We know that the Democrats are sticking with what they have. They've got a formula that they're very confident in. The Republican Party is in the midst of enormous change right now. And we'll see this next weekend who they pick as their leadership. Probably set the tone for the next 2 years of what the party's involved in and how they operate.
Okay, are you ready for Data Monday?
All right, let's do it. Kind of actually an interesting selection of items for Data Monday this year, and it is starting with the trade balance. I wanted to share the way that this works. So this is the overall trade that the U.S. has with the rest of the world, and we've had a trade deficit for quite some time. The lower this number gets, the bigger the trade deficit, because this on the y-axis is a negative number, and so it got really, really low, and now it's coming back. And that is because the dollar, as compared to the rest of the world, as there was a lot more demand for the U.S. dollar, as inflation was a problem all over the world. Even though we had inflation here, people had more confidence relative to the rest of the world in the U.S. dollar. So it made the dollar, quote unquote, strong, but that means that US goods are more expensive overseas. But that has abated some, and we've seen the trade deficit improve a little bit, and but still not to what we would call recent historical averages. So got some work yet to do there. There's a lot more things, like, for example, the battery plant being built in Marshall. That's the sort of thing that could actually positively impact the trade balance, having more of that manufacturing base being here. All right. So next is the just some expectations with respect to individuals, whether they feel better off or worse off. We're going to look at consumer sentiment in a moment. That's different. This question here, which is asked regularly by Gallup, was really, I think, the gold standard in polling on ongoing consumer issues. They just ask people, are you financially better off today compared to a year ago? And as you can see in the dotted line, which is shot straight up since 2020, that people are feeling worse off compared to a year ago, 50% worse off, 35% better off. That number was opposite not too long ago, where most people felt better off heading into the 2018, 2019 timeframe. Inflation has a lot to do with that. A lot of frustration still with how prices are rising higher than income or faster than income. But looking at consumer sentiment, the University of Michigan there's two things here. In blue, you see the sentiment, and in orange, you see the consumer expectations. Both of those bottomed out and are actually a little higher than they were partway through. They bottomed out about halfway through 2022. And while they're still at historically low levels, so in other words, consumer sentiment and consumer expectations are still absolutely not good right now, but appear to be generally trending in a better direction. So this is just an important thing. The American consumer and the attitude and expectations and confidence of the American consumer has a lot to say with what happens with our economy. Now, looking at expected change in unemployment in the next year, there is generally an expectation that there will be higher unemployment in the next year. So you see this index rising, although I would point out that dotted line you see across the middle of the screen, that would be kind of like the average over the last 40 years or so. And so even though the expectations for unemployment are higher, it's still coming in around the average around the average historical experience that we have. Now, looking at price, when you see the consumer sentiment in that previous slide rising a bit, and I think it has a lot to do with the expected prices in the next year. You'll see price increases over the next year expected to average more around 4.2%, and over the next 5 to 10 years to average around 2.9%. So I do think as inflation gets under control, you'll see consumers' attitude toward the overall economy improve a bit, and these numbers would suggest maybe that's starting a little bit. And then I thought it might, this is kind of an interesting look at housing conditions. So on the surveys, bad buying conditions for houses due to high prices and high interest rates, both of those, interestingly, still people consider the conditions bad overall, both on price and interest rate, but both seem to have turned over and are starting to come down. I know why on prices, because prices are moderating a bit, but interest rates actually have come down a little bit in terms of the mortgage rates. The Federal Reserve will not start ratcheting down their rates probably until the end of the year at the very earliest, maybe not till the beginning of next year. But mortgage interest rates and housing prices still high compared to what people are used to, and so even though there looks like consumer sentiment toward that has improved a bit, still pretty bad. And then the expectations with the stock market as well. I don't think I've ever shared this one with you before, but looking at a couple of different things. So the mean probability of increase in the stock market, according to U of M, but then also the portion of the consumer confidence expectation. Both of those are actually rising a bit. And so the stock market was really pummeled last year. Seemed to have hit in the last quarter of last year, hit the bottom, and has been higher since then, but certainly hasn't made up those gains. But expectations appear to be rising a bit. Here's the last slide, and this one's a little different type of data that goes into this. You notice every once in a while I'll pull these slides from Arbor Data Science. They have really unique and interesting ways of pulling data and gaining insight from them. And looking at Google search hits, the inference here is that on inflation, recession, and stagflation, that which is like a bad economy and high inflation, those the way that the amount of times that people are searching for that have started to come down. So trying to understand what it is, what's going to happen, and the inference here being that when people are Googling these things, they're more worried about them, and if they are not Googling them as much, they're less worried about them. Actually, pretty reasonable conclusion, I think, from that. So I thought I'd just share that there's several things that things look like they're settling down a bit to me, and that's good news. I think to the extent that we don't have these wide fluctuations or variations, we'll certainly have better economic performance, and so much of what we kind of live off here in the United States is just the expectation that consumers have, and it looks, again, things aren't in good shape in that sense, but look like maybe they bottom out. Maybe we're heading in a better direction in terms of American consumer, even though there's little economic reason to expect that we're about to take off or anything. It really does look like more of an uncertain and maybe kind of soft economy in the near future. But if prices settle down, I think you'll see consumers feel a lot better about it.
All right. I think the sunshine has given you a little bit of a sunnier outlook on things, so we'll be able to end on a higher note. I do want to remind everyone that we'll be in Marquette this Thursday, the 16th, for our owner-to-owner event. It's from 4 to 6 p.m. There's actually a business summit happening earlier in the day. So if you're in Marquette or nearby and would like to join us, please visit sbam.org/events for more details. We still have room to have you register. Thanks again to our sponsor, Consumers Credit Union, and we'll be back here Thursday at 3 p.m.
Yeah, we'll see you on Thursday, and I'll be broadcasting from the UP. I'm personally heading up to Marquette for that. We're teaming up with Operation Action UP. There'll be some small business awards given. There's a business owners summit that afternoon, and then an opportunity to just hang out together with other business owners for the owner-to-owner meeting and reception there at the very end. Please do check out sbam.org to join us there.